infrastructure solutions. Prior to this, we have spoken about designing infrastructure in terms of compute solutions. Now we are going to talk about designing infrastructure solutions in terms of storage management. The data, what we would go ahead and manage, how or all the other different tools or let's say different storage services which are offered can be utilized based on organizational need is what we are looking at. So when we talk about designing solutions for your data storage, as we know that the storage is offered in many different options based on the data types, based on your frequency of data, based on location, and also along with this, there are different data storage services which are offered as we will see further. But as of now, when we talk about designing for data storage, the major thing what we discuss is the very first thing to go ahead and decide is that we will have to first identify the data what an organization is dealing with. What do I mean by this? Either the organization would be dealing in structured data, where the requirement could be in terms of dedicated database, DB services, which I would want to have a look at, right? My requirement could be in terms of semi-structured, or which you can refer it as data which is less organized, or it could be unstructured, where we say that this is the least organized data. Now, based on what my requirement is, basically, I would have to decide what storage solutions I would want to bring in. Which service which suit the best is based on what data type my organization is dealing with, right? So we will have to make sure to first identify the data type. Either am I dealing with structured, semi-structured, or unstructured data. Now, based on that, we will go ahead and talk about defining or designing my data store. So the very first thing, as we know, when we move towards Azure, when we have to deal with storage, the very first thing I'll have to go ahead and create is a storage account, right? A storage account, a public service. Basically, I'll have to decide on what is my storage account type. And then later on, within my storage account, I decide whether I would want to have structured data, unstructured data, semi-structured data. What kind of a data? Am I dealing with file share services? Am I dealing with something where I want to share my storage, right, along multiple users? What is the service? I might have requirement of message queuing services, any storage related services I would want to do. The very first thing is I would have to go ahead and define what is my storage account type. So the first thing you will go ahead and create is a storage account. Now, just to have an understanding, if we have a look at here, when you go ahead and create your storage account, you have got these many options basically based on which you will go ahead and create a storage account. Either you have standard, general purpose, you go with premium blocks block, premium file share, or premium page block. Now, as we can see, the use cases where I would want to have blob services, data lake, queuing services, Azure tables or Azure files to be in place, I would go ahead and create a standard general purpose version 2 account type. Right? This is something which you will come across when we are going ahead and creating a storage account. Similarly, if you're dealing something where only blob storage or data lake is your concern, you are nowhere dealing with queue tables or Azure files going further in your organization, then there is no need for you to go ahead and create it under standard general purpose V2. You will just go ahead and create blob. If your requirement is to deal with file system only, basically when I say file system, it is shared file system where I would want to share my storage based on some protocols. I would go ahead and utilize only Azure files. If I'm only dealing with page browse where I would want something in terms of high performance, I would go ahead and utilize my premium page block. Now, this standard general purpose V2 serves most of the requirement. Hence, in case you create this later on, if there are any requirements which are coming up in terms of file share, in terms of message queuing services, in terms of tables, it could be handled by the same storage account. But if you go ahead and create and your box will go ahead and create a dedicated storage account for this. So for having that into consideration, we first decide what is the storage type I would go ahead and deal with, right? So that is where we are dealing. Now, once we have an understanding of what account type I would want to utilize, then we start planning, right? Based on other parameters, which you go ahead and create your storage account. If I have any replication requirements, your DRs, or to have a geographical availability of your data, how easily I would be able to replicate to different regions if I'm dealing with multiple regions, right? If there are any compliance requirement by your organization when you create a storage account. Now, all these is something acting as an additional parameter which you will consider at the time of creating a storage account, right? So we would go ahead and look into all these parameters as well. Once we are clear with this, then we talk about creating data redundancy. Now, what do I mean by this? Now, initially we discovered what is my organizational data type where I would be dealing with. Then I would go ahead and create a storage account. Once we have the storage account in place, the data which will be stored under that storage account, how is that getting replicated? What is the level of redundancy I would come across when I am choosing these storage services is what I am looking at. So what do I exactly mean by this? As we know, there are multiple replication strategies available when we come towards Azure. That is, we talk in terms of your storage replication strategies, which refers as LRS, ZRS, GRS, and RAGRS. Basically, understanding that if I go ahead and choose my replication strategy to be LRS, referring to locally redundant storage, then what am I trying to go ahead and do? I am just trying to say that the data when I'm going ahead and storing under a storage account and the replication strategy for that storage account refers to LRS, then the data what would be stored under that storage account will only be locally redundant. That is, in case if there is any failure locally within the same region, the data would not be highly available. So based on how much highly available data you would want, then based on that, I would go ahead and choose the replication strategy, right? So just to understand, we say rack against disk failure, against rack failures. Locally redundant storage is fine. This can help you replicate. But what in case if an AZ goes down, if an availability zone goes down, will your data be highly available? Say no, because it is getting locally replicated within a region. It could be within the same availability zone. It could be across multiple availability zone. That is something where we do not have control. We are just saying it could be locally redundant, right? That it would be available. If there is any failure of availability zone, there will be no promise on your data being highly available. So what is that which I can take care to make sure that the data is highly available? I can choose my replication strategy to be what ZR is, that is zone redundant storage. Now, when I say zone redundant storage, what is happening? We are saying there would be multiple copies getting created when you store your data, and those copies will be replicated across the availability zones within the same region. In this scenario, even if one availability zone goes down, you still have other availability zones from where your data will be highly available. Now, once we address this, maybe my organization needs says that I would want still more higher, highly available data. Now, what do I mean by this? Here it was against rack failure or disk failure protection, but it was not available for AZ. But when I chose zone redundant storage, my zone level redundancy is achieved. But at the same time, what if the complete region goes down? If the region itself is going down, is my data still being highly available? No. Then what should I do? I will have to go ahead and choose my replication strategy to be GRS. That is geo redundant storage, right? Geo redundant storage, what is this helping us do? This basically replicates data across two regions. Now, when I do a, a copy or when I go ahead and choose GRS to be my redundant or replication strategy, even if a region is going down, still my data is available in a secondary region. Okay? So based on these parameters, you will go ahead and choose. Once you have your storage account in place, you will choose the replication strategies to ensure your data is highly available. Right? This is what we will have to look at. Now, once we are good with this understanding, then we would go ahead and actually start utilizing the services under your storage account. Now, when I say start using the services under a storage account, as we said, to go ahead and deal with any kind of a data, structured, semi-structured, unstructured, message queuing services, your files, Azure files, where it is a shared file system which is required. Anything you go ahead and do, we would go ahead and achieve that under a storage account itself. Now I have created my storage account. I have decided what is my replication strategy for the storage account. Then I would go ahead and define whether I would want to deal with blob storage, whether I would want to go ahead and deal with Azure file storage, whether I want to go ahead and deal with queuing services. What is my requirement, right? Now, what kind of a data am I dealing with? That is where we are saying the very first thing you will go ahead and deal with is your blob storage, which is again referred as binary large object storage, which I'm pretty much sure by now you will have an understanding of this, right? Azure blob storage. Now, under that blob storage, you will again go ahead and identify what is the data type for my organization dealing with, whether it is data, whether it is a pool data, whether it is an archivable data, right? Now, what do we refer by this? I will have to identify and understand the data which is getting generated in my organization. Is it a hot data? Now, what is a hot data? Something which is active and very frequently utilized, very frequently accessed, right? At that point of time, I will have to determine the storage tier. If my requirement is not free, it is infrequent data which I'm trying to access, then I would go ahead and choose full as my storage tier. Now, the reasons why I would want to go ahead and do all these planning, we understand this by addressing 2 points. One is to understand or address the performance. Second is your cost. Now, all these pricing tiers will have different costs along and will be performing accordingly. Now, you should not end up in a situation where your data is meant for frequent access, but you have kept it under infrequent access, which is affecting your performance. On the other hand, the situation should also not be in a place where my requirement is infrequent access, but I have kept it under frequent access. The reason I would end up paying more, that is cost. So always to match the price to performance ratio, we will have to go ahead and design our solutions accordingly. So similarly, when we talk about these storage tiers, we have got hot, cool, and archivable data. Now we understood what will be your hot, what will be your cool. Archive data is something where we say, as the name itself suggests, is for archiving purposes or a data which is not even accessed infrequently. Basically, I would need it only at times at a very low frequency where let's say I have got some backups kept in place. When I would go ahead and utilize my backup only at the time when there is a downtime with the actual copy, with the actual machine. At that times, I would want the backup to be available and restore. One situation where I'm not using it on a daily basis or on a frequent basis. This is something which I will achieve. Along with that, there could be a possibility that you have data kept or stored or archived for compliance requirement, where your compliance says that once the data is generated, this data should be available for next 2, 3, or 4 years, or this data is required for you for an yearly audit. That is only in once in a year is where your data should be accessed. Now, in such situations, I would go ahead and choose the storage tier accordingly. Right? So it is important for us to go ahead and understand the type of data where an organization is dealing with and determine the storage tier accordingly. Right? Once we have this understanding, then I can go ahead and talk about addressing the requirement where I have shared file system, where I'm saying I have data to be shared across multiple users. And when I come towards cloud, I would want to utilize the same. Basically, I would want to share it across everybody. There are multiple users. Now, is there anything which I can utilize? So we are saying, yes, you have got Azure files, which you can utilize for your shared file system. We are just trying to understand the available protocols between your Azure file and Azure blob, just to see the difference that yes, this is the reasons why we have to go with identifying what is my data, what type of data am I dealing with, and why there are different storage classes. Now, if I have a requirement where my data has to be accessed on an SMB protocol and I'm storing it under blob, as you can see, blob does not have support of SMB. Okay. So similarly, there are different use case scenarios, but just to have an understanding, general understanding, we are just trying to address. But as we know, Azure file is something which is referring for shared file system where my data should be available on the network and is being able to access within multiple environments, and I would want to manage them, then I would go ahead and utilize Azure file, right? Azure files. Now, this is what the understanding we are taking. And at last, we are saying your Azure disk solution. Basically, whenever we are dealing with Azure VMs, right? Now, VMs are backed up. The storage of the VM is backed up by your disks, right? So this is what we are taking an understanding. When we are talking about disk as a solution also, there are a couple of parameters which you would have to consider. Now, what are we trying to say? Whenever we talk about Azure VMs, there are data disks which are attached, right? Now, these data disks are available in multiple variations, again, based on what is your requirement. First thing is on the basis of the mechanism, whether you want to utilize under SSD or you would want to utilize something on the mechanism of HDD, you would go ahead and choose. Under these, there are different types: ultra, premium, standard, and standard. Now, these differ basically from each other on the basis of performance and the type of workload where they support. So basically, based on this, we will have to go ahead and choose which type of data disk as a solution you want to utilize it. Right. So keeping all these into consideration, Now, whether I would want something which is requiring a specific IOPS, that is input output per second operation kind of a workload is what you're looking for, then you will have to choose the dedicated disk which is referred for or is mentioned or is offered under that performance, right? It doesn't make sense for me to go ahead and launch something under an HDD mechanism and request for a higher input output mechanism. That would create performance issues, right? So just to have that understanding, you will go ahead and look at these solutions before you decide what type of data disk should be a part of your VMs. So these are all the storage solution types which are available. For now, we are marking an end with the module where we are taking understanding of storage, and further more modules we will talk about your queuing services and data lake services, right? Thank you.